The soldiers met on the banks of the Elbe River in May of 1945. American soldiers and Soviet soldiers. They embraced. They celebrated. The war in Europe was over. Nazi Germany had been defeated. But in that moment of celebration, something profound was happening. Soviet soldiers were seeing, for the first time, what American soldiers had. And what they saw shocked them. An American soldier had boots made of leather. Real leather, not canvas, not felt, leather. A Soviet soldier had boots made of whatever materials were available. An American soldier had a uniform made of quality cloth. A Soviet soldier had a uniform made of rough material. An American soldier had a rifle that was clean and well maintained. A Soviet soldier had a rifle that was serviceable, but not well maintained. But most shocking of all was the food. American soldiers had canned meat. Real meat. They had canned vegetables. They had chocolate. They had coffee. They had cigarettes. Soviet soldiers had bread and whatever else they could find. The contrast was stark. The American soldier was well fed, well clothed, and well equipped. The Soviet soldier was adequately fed, adequately clothed, and adequately equipped. This was not a matter of individual soldiers being treated differently. This was a matter of industrial capacity. The American system of production could provide every soldier with quality equipment and adequate supplies. The Soviet system of production could provide every soldier with adequate equipment and minimal supplies. The difference was not in the quality of the soldiers. The difference was in the capacity of the industrial system that supported them. The Soviet Union had suffered enormously during the war. The Germans had invaded Soviet territory and had destroyed vast areas. Soviet factories had been evacuated to the east. Soviet agriculture had been disrupted. Soviet industry had been focused entirely on the production of weapons. There was nothing left for civilian consumption. There was nothing left for anything except the war effort. But even during the war, the Soviet Union had received assistance from America. The Lend-Lease program had provided the Soviet Union with trucks, jeeps, food, and other supplies. The Soviets had received over 400,000 trucks from America. These trucks had been essential to Soviet logistics. Without American trucks, the Soviet army would have been unable to move supplies to the front lines. Without American trucks, the Soviet victory would have been impossible. Stalin himself had acknowledged this. At the Tehran conference, Stalin had stated that without American production, the war would have been lost. This was not a statement that came easily to Stalin. Stalin was proud. Stalin believed in Soviet superiority. But Stalin was also a realist. He understood that American production had been decisive. But what shocked the Soviet leadership most was not just the quantity of American production. It was the quality. It was the efficiency. It was the fact that America could produce such enormous quantities of such high-quality goods while still maintaining a civilian economy. While the Soviet Union was sacrificing everything for the war effort, America was producing weapons and supplies while also maintaining factories that produced consumer goods. The Soviet Union had expected that after the war, America would collapse into economic depression. The Soviets believed that American capitalism was inherently unstable. They believed that without the war effort to sustain it, the American economy would fall apart. They believed that American workers would be thrown into unemployment. They believed that American society would be torn apart by class conflict. Instead, something very different happened. After the war, American production did not collapse. American factories did not close. American workers did not face mass unemployment. Instead, American production was redirected toward civilian goods. American factories began producing cars, refrigerators, and consumer goods. American workers began enjoying a standard of living that was unprecedented in human history. The Soviet Union, by contrast, faced a very different situation. Soviet factories had been destroyed. Soviet agriculture had been devastated. Soviet workers were exhausted, Soviet resources were depleted. The Soviet Union had won the war, but it had paid an enormous price. The Soviet Union had lost over 27 million people. The Soviet Union had lost vast territories. The Soviet Union had lost much of its industrial capacity. The Soviet leadership realized that they could not compete with America in terms of consumer production. The Soviet Union could not provide its citizens with cars, refrigerators, and consumer goods. The Soviet Union could not provide its citizens with a high standard of living. The Soviet Union could only provide its citizens with the bare necessities of life. This realization was the beginning of the Cold War. The Soviet leadership understood that they were facing an enemy that was not just militarily superior, but economically superior. An enemy that could produce more weapons, more supplies, and more consumer goods than the Soviet Union could ever hope to produce. An enemy that could offer its citizens a standard of living that the Soviet Union could never match. The Soviet response was to focus on military production. The Soviet Union could not compete with America in terms of consumer goods, but the Soviet Union could compete in terms of weapons. The Soviet Union could build tanks, aircraft, and missiles. The Soviet Union could build nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union could build a military machine that was powerful and threatening. But this strategy had a fatal flaw. The Soviet Union was trying to compete with America in a war of production. The Soviet Union was trying to build as many weapons as America was building. But the Soviet Union did not have the industrial capacity to do this. The Soviet Union did not have the resources to do this. The Soviet Union could not afford to do this. The American system of production was not just more efficient than the Soviet system. It was fundamentally different. The American system was based on private enterprise, competition, and profit. The American system encouraged innovation and efficiency. The American system rewarded companies that could produce more with less. The Soviet system was based on central planning. The Soviet system was based on the idea that the state could plan the entire economy. The Soviet system was based on the idea that workers would work for the good of the state, not for personal profit. The Soviet system was inefficient by design. It was designed to ensure that everyone had an equal share, not to maximize production. The Soviet leadership did not fully understand this at the time. They believed that the difference in production was due to the fact that America had not been invaded. They believed that if the Soviet Union could rebuild its factories and restore its agriculture, it could match American production. They believed that Soviet workers, working for the good of the state, could be as productive as American workers, working for personal profit. They were wrong. The Soviet system was fundamentally incapable of matching American production. The Soviet system was fundamentally incapable of providing its citizens with a high standard of living. The Soviet system was fundamentally incapable of competing with America in a war of production. This realization would shape the entire Cold War. The Soviet Union would spend the next 45 years trying to compete with America in a war of production. The Soviet Union would spend trillions of rubles on weapons production. The Soviet Union would sacrifice the welfare of its citizens for military production. And in the end, the Soviet Union would lose. Not because of military defeat, but because of economic collapse. The shock that Soviet soldiers felt when they saw American soldiers in 1945 was the beginning of the end. It was the moment when the Soviet leadership realized that they were facing an enemy that was not just militarily superior, but economically superior. An enemy that could outproduce them. An enemy that could out-innovate them. An enemy that could offer its citizens a better life. This was a shock from which the Soviet Union would never fully recover.
This is one of the wars that changed the world.